We'll be finishing the book of 1 Samuel today, and then moving on into 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel 28. My earpiece is all crooked and weird and fitting strangely. There we go. All right. 1 Samuel 28. I think probably everybody read it and is familiar with some of these stories, and hopefully we'll be able to dig in. We left off on Wednesday night talking about how Saul has continually gone downhill, and that it seems that everything is leading up to this final moment here in Saul's life. This is kind of his last big sin that we read about. He is up against fighting the Philistines. We'll come back to that point in a minute. We're up against fighting the Philistines, and because he is fighting the Philistines, he of course wants to know whether he's going to be successful at fighting the Philistines or not. And what's he do? How does he try to figure this out? Okay, so, and interestingly, before that, he actually tries to do it the right way, right? We don't really read a lot of positive about Saul, and I try to always focus on the positive when we can. So it's interesting here at the beginning of chapter 28, it says, verse 3, Samuel had died, and all Israel mourned for him. Saul had removed the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Verse 5, when Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was afraid. Verse 6, he inquired of the Lord. Yay! Saul's finally learning something, right? Yeah, I mean, a little late here for Saul, because we know that the story of Saul, God has left him, God is no longer with him. So when Saul asked of the Lord, he's not getting an answer. Okay, God has not in any way interacting with Saul at this point. Also, it's interesting, the Lord did not answer him in dreams or by what? The What is the Who knows? Thank you for clearing that up. That's but my answer is no better than that. So we don't really know what the Urim and the Thummim is. They're just kind of this thing that we read about. What do we know about them? Let's at least discuss that. Say it again. Okay, somehow they would provide God's answers. Okay, well, I heard over here. Okay, reveal God's answers, yes. Okay, they were worn by the high priest. They are generally associated with the ephod. I don't know, the ephod we know had the 12 different stones in it, right? One for each of the tribe. I believe I'm remembering this correctly. But there's also an Urim and a Thummim that's part of the ephod or tucked away in a pocket. They're somehow attached to the ephod, and so it was something that the high priest had as a part of that. It's way too loud. A beeping. I can't hear it. Feedback? Does somebody want to go slightly? Because I'm loud to myself up here, so I don't know if somebody wants to go slightly turn it down. Anybody? I can walk back there, but it seems like a long trip. It's for something that I can't even hear. I can just take the microphone off too. So I'm nice and loud, so I'm not worried about that. So we don't really know a lot about the Urim and the Thummim. Some of the things that I've heard, just suggestions or just ideas, maybe it was kind of like the drawing of lots or the casting of dice. So there were two stones that had markings on them that you could cast them like dice, and that would give you a yes or a no or unsure, kind of like a magic 8-ball. You turn it over and turn it up. Not likely, that something like that. I don't personally think it's like that. The reason is when you see them being used, they provide more than a yes or a no. And maybe it's by the process of elimination that they get to that. But we're going to come back and talk about this a little bit later with David, and as a result of interacting with the ephod, he gets a direct verbal answer from God. And it seems to me that the Urim and the Thummim in some way bring about an actual interaction with God, not some by chance process of elimination. So I don't know how it works. All we know is that God gave them this tool, because remember the Urim and the Thummim were part of God's explanation of the high priestly garments and such like that. And he gave them this tool as a way of discovering his answers. So it was God's, essentially a gift from God that was given to them to receive God's answers. It's also interesting to me that the Urim and the Thummim can be silent, because isn't that the case here with Saul? So it's not some process by which you are guaranteed an answer from God. It could also remain silent, because Saul is given no answer at all. And I find that to be telling, because what it does is it reveals to us that we know exactly what Randy said we know, nothing. We don't have a clue how this works. This is another one of those great mysteries that when I get to heaven, I hope there's some heavenly throne room, movie room, and we can kind of watch how some of this works. At that point, I'm sure I won't care, but it would be interesting to have some of the answers to some of these things. So Saul is scared. He receives no answer from God, and so he does exactly what Larry said. He seeks out a medium or a spiritist who can give him answers and call back from the dead Samuel. And so you've got this whole story of how Saul disguises himself. Well, first he questions his servant, where's there a medium that I can go get answers from? It's interesting to me, again, how we've talked again and again about how Saul doesn't really have respect from his servant. The law he passed said no more mediums, no more spiritists. But as soon as he asked a servant, hey, where's a medium, what can they say? Oh, there's one right over here. You know, and so clearly, even though Saul has commanded in the past, at least at some point, there will be no more mediums, there will be no more spiritists, there still is one, and the one that is there is known about. So it's not even like there's a, she's apparently well known, you know, or at least known enough that Saul's own servant know there is an illegal woman doing illegal things over here in this place. So just kind of gives you kind of points to the fact that maybe there still is a lack of respect for Saul's rule in the way things are going. So he goes, he disguises himself, he sits down with this woman. The woman, I find it interesting, you know, because Saul's disguised. So what's her immediate answer when he says, hey, I need you to do this service for me? Yeah, I can't do that. Saul made that illegal. Okay, you know, that's not something I'm allowed to do. And he says, as surely as the Lord lives, no punishment will come to you from this. Why do you think she says what she says and then he says that? Okay, I don't know that she knows it's Saul at this point, but I do think she knows it is someone important, because it doesn't seem that Saul comes alone. Saul has a whole cohort of people with him, servants with him, because we read that later when she kills the fatted calf and feeds all of them. So even if she doesn't know it's Saul, it seems she knows it's somebody who could get her in trouble. okay? Because she says, I can't do this. Saul says it's illegal. And of course, Saul's answer kind of reveals who he is, doesn't it? I mean, he says, oh, I promise you, you're not going to be punished for this. Well, why would he say that unless he had the ability to punish her for this? So that in and of itself is kind of odd. Yes, Meredith? Do what? Yeah, maybe. Maybe this kind of a civil agent coming in and seeing if she really is this person, or kind of a spy coming in. Is that what you mean? Yeah. I don't know. It is an odd conversation here, right at the very beginning. Of course, Saul says, no punishment will come to you. She says, who do you want to see? He says, Samuel. And of course, she does the job of bringing Samuel back from the dead. Okay, and it's interesting. She kind of is astonished, and there's different reasons for that. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then he says, describe what you see. And she says, and I put the quote on the screen, I see a God coming up out of the earth, an old man coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. And Saul immediately knows what? That's Samuel. Okay? Samuel has the response and says what? Yeah. Who brings me out of deep? He's not pleased with being woken up. And Saul says, well, I need help. I need to know. And of course, Samuel's answer is what? Yeah. God's not answering you because God is not with you. You will die. And interestingly, Samuel even gives him a time frame. When will he die? Tomorrow. Okay? Which lets you know, again, 1 Samuel is not in chronological order, because this chapter 28, skips essentially all the way to chapter 31, and the chapters in between are a backstory of things going on with David, because we assume David didn't do all the things he did in chapter 29 and 30 within the course of 24 hours. So things aren't necessarily in chronological order, but it is interesting here to see Samuel basically just says, had you just listened to me all the years I was alive, you wouldn't have needed to wake me up, because my answer is the same. God has deserted you because of your sin, and that's why God's not responding to you, and no, you're not going to be blessed. Okay, Janet? Yeah. I mean, it's more than God's absent. It's that God's working against you. Which, of course, if God's working against you, how successful are you going to be? Not so much. And that's exactly the lesson that Saul learns here. So Samuel's message is one of despair, and it's not what Saul wanted to hear, but of course, because it is Samuel's message and Samuel speaks for God, it is a true message. And so that becomes an important part. So the medium then goes and serves Saul and his men, kills the fatted calf, serves them food, and this is probably the last good meal that Saul ever has. We skipped over the first point at the very beginning of the chapter, which is what's going on with David. Okay, David has become the bodyguard for Achish of Gath. Okay, and we're going to go back and talk about that in just a moment when we get to talking about chapters 29 and 30. I do want to bring up this point at least. I was brought up with the idea, and probably this is what you've heard and been taught or even taught yourself, that the reason the medium was astonished was what? Yeah, she didn't expect this to work. She's a trickster. She's just making things up as she goes along. I'm not sure that's true. We say that oftentimes because we don't believe that mediums or spiritists have any power whatsoever, and therefore they're all fake. They're no different than a palm reader that you see practicing today. But in the Old Testament, there were plenty of people who actually seemed to have had powers of some sort. If you just take the language of Scripture, this woman was effectively capable of bringing Samuel out of his sleep, bringing Samuel back from the dead. And it seems that just as possible that the reason she's astonished, if you look there, verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, and then she asked Saul, "Why did you deceive me? You are Saul." Isn't it just as likely she's astonished and screaming or scared because she's been caught? Right? This is the man who told her she can't exist. And so it's just as likely that that's her fear as it is the fear of her actually being effective at doing what she's doing. The two priests in Egypt, were they able to do things? Now, we can explain it away by saying they just happened to drop red powder in the water, and that's how the water became blood under their ability. But they were also able to make frogs appear. They were able to turn their staffs into snakes. And again, I've heard so many explanations to try to explain away that they had any power whatsoever. Like, there's a particular type of snake that has a pressure point on its head that if you hold that pressure point, it goes stiff, and then you can shape it into a long staff. And that's what they would carry around just for the occasion in which they needed to throw their staff down and make it look like a snake. I mean, that's just regular, isn't it? That's what I would do, Or it's possible that there are powers that have existed in the Old Testament, like demons, which also existed in the New Testament, that people could utilize if they weren't following after the one true God and they were seeking after other powers. Okay? There are people who could tell the future in the New Testament. Great physical strength, superhuman strength, came from both demons and from God, right? There are plenty of examples of people who have powers, even in the Old Testament, and powers that aren't associated with Yahweh. But what comes very obvious all the way through is that all of the powers that aren't associated with Yahweh are very weak when compared to the powers of Yahweh. While the devil could grant special abilities, or demons, or false gods, or however they are referred to in the Old Testament, they always play second fiddle to God. God is always able to overcome it. When the Egyptian priests threw down their staff and they became snakes, or they loosened up their stiff joints, depending on the pressure point you were pushing. Anyway, however you want to explain it, what did Moses' staff snake do? Gobbled him up. When they were able to turn a small amount of water into blood, what had Moses been able to do through the power of God? The entire Nile River and even other pieces of water, bowls of water and such. When they were able to make some frogs appear, what had Moses been able to do? Cover the land with frogs. I mean, you see a big difference there when she's able to bring a spirit back from the dead for conversation. What is God able to do? Literally restore life to the dead. And bring up whole valleys of dead people and restore flesh and muscle to their bones, and they walk again, right? There's a big difference between the small powers of those who seek after the devil and the immense power that comes from following God. So I don't think it's something we need to be scared of or feel like we need to explain away, that there could have been people in the Old Testament with powers, because those powers never even slightly infringe on the power of God. And there's just a contrast created there. Yeah. Why would God care if they were all fake? Yeah. Other than it just, would give them a reason to pull away from God and believe in something else. But they did that anyway with idols. They did with other things. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and again, I'm not saying that this is the only way to understand this. I know people who believe very strongly. I know Tiffany was, before we got married, living with a couple so that we could be near each other because I was living in Texas and she was living in Texas. But Tiffany used to collect fairies. And the family that she was living with got very upset that she had all of these little fairy figurines because they disagreed with anything that could diminish or steal the power of God. So anything fantasy related or any of that, they just absolutely thought was sinful and wrong and asked her to take her fairy figurines down. My problem with that is, I appreciate the priority they placed on God and coming to that conclusion. But how does that rob anything from God? Whether it is something fictional like fairies or whether it is something real, like possibly the spiritist or the magicians for Pharaoh, none of that takes away from the immense sovereignty and authority and omnipotence of God. None of it. If this lady were truly able to bring Samuel back from the dead, and she had done so with many others that had passed on from this life, that still doesn't take away from the fact that God could restore those souls to the body, and that God is the keeper of those souls after death. She's not yanking this spirit away from God's control. It never implies that. And so it's just something I think sometimes we end up talking ourselves into circles. That would do it. So, yeah. Um, Similar idea going on here, where God is using the Philistine lord to stop David. Now, maybe David had a plan as to how he was going to do this in a way that was not going to be sinful, was not going to be him attacking his own people. We're not told. But we do know that he had planned to go out and protect Achish, and now he is being sent home so that he can't go out and protect Achish and fight against his own people. To me, I just see the provision of God in that, the way God protects his people and the way God is providing an opportunity. When he gets home, we have the story of the Amalekites who have come up and have attacked David's city. David living in Ziklag. The Amalekites have come up and they have sacked Ziklag, taken all the women, taken all the animals, taken the possessions of them. And so David has gone out to war. Now he and his men have returned home from war without having to have fought that war. He have to head off to war somewhere else, down toward the south, I believe, if I remember my maps correctly. And so he has to go and retrieve. Now, what's interesting about that is this. A couple of things happen here at the beginning of chapter 30. Okay? First of all, they get home and things are a disaster. How do the men respond? Do what? They blame David. Okay? Which is interesting to me. What have we known about all of these men with David so far? They have been loyal to David over and over and over again. They have been faithful to David. They have believed in David. But I kind of wonder, and this is an assumption on my part, I always try to tell you that, but I kind of wonder if they were not in agreement with going to war against their own people. That's my assumption. They get home from that, and there's that sense of, had you never taken us the wrong direction in the first place, this wouldn't have happened to our families. Okay, that is my assumption here. But they are mad enough that what do they want to do? Stone him. Okay, that's a pretty big deal here. David, in response to that, does he defend himself? What's he do? He talks to God. That to me, Tiffany and I were talking about that this morning, and she had made the point of it's that statement about David, and you hear it over and over again in David's life. He asked the Lord, he inquired of the Lord. That's what sets him apart from so many other leaders. You read that of Saul? Very rarely, and about the only time you read it is when we just talked about it a minute ago when God's already left him. Okay? How many other leaders would have prevented problems had they just asked the Lord first? Joshua and the Gibeonites, remember that? Just so many through the judges, they don't ask the Lord, they just act, which is one of the pieces that you see in that downward spiral of people pulling away from God. But what you read of David again and again is that he asked the Lord, and it's funny, whenever he asks the Lord, he's blessed. Whenever he doesn't ask the Lord, you've got these places in David's life where you're going, David, really? Like, what were you thinking? Like, we have that reaction. Like, not at all. Not at all. And again, I find that to be very telling of, and an excellent point of, he didn't ask, should I go protect Achish? That was his decision, and he wasn't allowed to, and his men got mad at him for it. But when he asked this time, he does. Now, what's interesting about him asking of the Lord is, how does he ask the Lord? Yeah, we assume some sort of Urim and Thummim, because he asked the priest to bring the ephod to him, and he inquired of the Lord, so it's associated with the ephod. It doesn't mention the Urim and Thummim here, as far as I'm aware. Saul apparently still had that. Maybe there were more than one. Maybe there's more than one ephod. I don't know exactly how all of that worked. But he has the ephod brought to him. He inquires of the Lord, and the Lord gives him a very specific answer, right? So he inquires, should I pursue these raiders? Will I overtake them? The Lord replied to him, this is verse 8 of chapter 30, pursue them, for you will certainly overtake them and rescue the people. That doesn't seem like a yes or no answer, which is why I say I think it's more than the rolling of dice. There's something supernatural to these rocks and how they bring an interaction between the questioner and God. But it is interesting here, ephod's brought, God gives him a specific answer. He trusts in that answer. They go in pursuit. While in pursuit, they leave 200 of their 600 men behind because they're just exhausted, which is understandable. You got to remember, they went out to war, they returned from war, they found everything was missing, that's emotional, that very difficult to deal with, and they immediately set off in pursuit of these Amalekites. 200 of them are too tired. David leaves them behind to watch the baggage, to kind of watch over their possessions that they still have, and the other 400 continue in pursuit. They find an Egyptian man who's able to point them in the right direction, and they go and they destroy the Amalekites. They fight them from twilight all the way through the next evening. They destroy all of them except for a small group that escape on camels, and the people end up trusting in David again. What do they say about the spoils of war? These belong to David. Okay, so they believe again in David. They no longer want to stone him. They believe in him again. And it's interesting that David, there's a whole episode in here of how David treated his men fairly. Because when they got back to the 200 that stayed behind, what did the 400 say? Yeah, they didn't fight for this stuff. This shouldn't belong to them. And David's response is, yeah, they played a role too. We're not going to be stingy. We're not going to, we're going to share with everybody. We're a team, all right? The team gets the credit. That's the idea here. And it's interesting, he also sends part of the spoils of war to the elders that were friendly of the cities in Israel that were friendly to him. And so he is again showing he is back on board with the idea of those being his people. So if his going with Achish was, in a sense, a rejection of his own people, what you have at the end of the chapter is an acceptance that those are still his people. And so maybe there's a contrast there between the way David felt at the beginning, God keeping him from sinning, and God guiding him and protecting him and bringing him victory, and him being back on board with God and the idea that he was anointed king over these people. So I kind of wonder if there's not a weakness moment here, and God corrects that, and in that course correction, he gets back on board with the way things should be. The next day, according to the whole medium story, so this is, again, that story. These two stories of David are probably back stories. They're background stories to Saul's war. But Saul goes to the medium. The next day he goes to war. He is killed or pierced through with an arrow, and it's a fatal blow of some sort. We don't know exactly where he's hit, but he's going to die, and so he asks his armor bearer to do what? Kill me. Run me through. The armor bearer refuses to do it, which again is interesting, the way that people tend to not being obedient to Saul. So Saul ends up falling on his own sword, and we know that his armor bearer does the same thing. We know that his sons were killed in this battle, so Jonathan also dies. And then there's the story of the way the Philistines took care of this. They cut off Saul's head. They took Saul's weaponry. They stuck it in their temple. They pinned the bodies of Saul and his sons up on the wall of one of their temples. And the men of Jabesh Gilead went and retrieved the bodies, and they brought them back to Israel, and they buried them. So that's the end of 1 Samuel. I bring this back up because to me it's just interesting. It's probably boring to all of you guys, but I find it interesting just how many parallels there are. David has a great victory over a giant. He has a great victory over many others. You've got the Goliath's head being cut off and his weapons being put in the tabernacle. You have Saul's head being cut off and put in his weaponry being put in the temples of the Philistine. You got David marrying Michal, David marrying Abigail, David protected by an unlikely relationship. What was that in the early part of the story? You got Jonathan there, Saul's son. It's not, you would think there would be conflict there. The one who should have inherited the throne and the one who was anointed as the new king of the throne, but David gets protected by that. You get the same thing with David being protected by the enemy. He's protected by the Philistines in chapter 29. You've got David inquiring of the ephod that should be, that's David back, and then David doing it again. David runs to Philistia, David spares Saul, and he spares Saul. You've got all these parallels that are kind of circling around that one verse, Samuel dies. Okay, all of these things that happen before Samuel dies, and then a mirrored story happening after Samuel dies. And it's interesting, the way it works is before Samuel dies, everything seems to be going downhill. Things get worse and worse and worse. David can't even be, he's run out of his own homeland. He's run out of even his enemy's homeland. He's got nothing going for him except for his dependency on God. After Samuel dies, you have an upward trajectory in David's life where everything starts getting better. Okay, I'm not saying that things get better because Samuel dies. I think there is an intentional organization to the story to help us see something. Samuel marks the end of the period of the judges. And the period of the judges is identified by that very important statement right at the end of the period of the judges. There was no king in Israel. What's the rest of it? Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Samuel dies which marks the end of that period of the judges and the beginning of the period of the king. Now, I know Saul is king, but Saul is really a king in the flavor of that unrighteous kingdom of the judges. Samuel dies, judges end, and now we've got David, who is continually again and inquiring what God wants him to do, and he's doing what is right in God's eyes, and every time he does that, he's blessed and things get better. And so there seems to just be that kind of mark right there at the beginning of chapter 25 that helps us see things have turned. Things are better. Things are going to get increasingly better, and it's going to go from a king on the run for his life to a king who is the greatest king that Israel ever experiences. And that helps us see the story of David. So we'll see that really beginning here in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. So go ahead and read chapter 1 through the beginning of chapter 5, and we'll cover that on Wednesday night. So thank you.